ocean, you get you get these types of habitats, and they're really important for flood protection, which basically means that as the waters rise, if it's near, if it's by an ocean or if it's by another river, if the river swells, these areas can absorb a lot of water, and they're accustomed to that. The animals and plants are accustomed to it, and you get less chance of floods on the banks of the river. And water filtering is also really important. So there are a lot of small organisms, bacteria, clams. There's just lots of organisms that live in these habitats that they're called filter feeders. And they basically take in the water that's kind of dirty as it comes down and are essentially purifying it as it goes out into the ocean. So you can think of these as basically a big sponge. And if you poured water through a sponge, what would come out on the other end would be much cleaner than if you poured water directly into a bucket. So basically the sponge is going to absorb a lot of water and filter it out. And it's also a very rich nutrient source, basically meaning that there's a lot of organisms and plants, animals and plants thriving in these areas because they tend to be very warm and nutrient rich, and they're also bringing all the nutrients down from the headwaters, and so actually sometimes they can become too nutrient rich, as we'll talk about later in the year, but as all of the nutrients flow down the river, they're collected in these areas. Okay, so that takes care of the three categories of freshwater biomes. Estuaries are in the middle of freshwater and saltwater, both in the sequence of slides, because they literally are in the middle between these two types of habitats. So if you look at this picture, an estuary essentially is where fresh water from a river mixes with the salt water of the ocean. Okay, as you can imagine, these areas are highly variable, both in their temperature, their salinity, and how deep light can penetrate, because if you have water that's basically deeper, the light can't go down as far. And these things, the temperature and the salinity, depend on the time of year. So in the spring, when all the water's melting from mountains, ice, the snow cap and everything, the river is going to flow more quickly, and there's going to be more water. Temperature is going to go down. Salinity is going to go down too, because you have more fresh water, as opposed to in the summer months and towards the fall, there isn't as much water flowing, so the temperature gets, and it's also warmer outside, the temperature goes up, and the salinity also goes up because you don't have as much water, and the water is evaporating, the salinity of the salt concentration is going to go up. Okay, so highly, and also in terms of depth of light penetration, when you have lower water, the light can penetrate deeper. Okay, so these areas are very, very productive, and you can see here's a marsh. So a marsh is a type of estuary. You can have a marsh up here too. Basically, the definition of marsh being that it's an area where water is covering it, where fresh water is covering it. So it can both be in a freshwater habitat or an estuary habitat. Okay, so again, they're highly productive because, as in the other marsh, my description of the marsh before, the nutrients are coming in from land. So basically, the water is percolating through different parts of a land, and all the water and nutrients are running off into the river, and this is collected over the entire, if you can imagine, the land coming up here and the river still going up here. The whole land is basically, all the water from the land is percolating into this river. So as you get to the estuary, all those nutrients have collected. I apologize for the messy notes on here. Tends to be warm water because it is shallower, and it's very sheltered. So the sheltered, basically nature, you have kind of the land kind of wrapping around it. And this makes it a very good place for small animals, or for animals to breed, especially fish. And think of what an example is close by. I'll leave that, well, I'll give you a hint. It looks like this. Okay, so we live by a very large estuary, and a very important estuary for many kind of sharks, actually, different species of sharks and fish, where they're basically enclosed. So this is water. Okay, this is San Francisco Bay. And this whole area is very sheltered. So a lot of animals come in to breed and then go back out into the ocean when they're big enough to survive in the ocean. Okay, now on to marine ecosystems. So they're divided into 3 different life zones. You can read here the pelagic, the intertidal, and the benthic zone. So essentially pelagic means all the open ocean water, and this, you can see it written here, is this entire, is basically the ocean, okay? So the main part of the ocean, and there are 2 divisions within that, which are the Nerdic province, which is this kind of area over the continental shelf, and then the oceanic, so just the big open expanse of ocean, and it spans this whole way, and it's basically where it's really deep, and different types of animals and fish and even in plant life are going to live here versus the more shallow area there. Okay, so that's the pelagic. It's basically the open ocean. The intertidal, these are fascinating habitats. This is the area basically that it's the shoreline that experiences different levels of water cover as you go from high to low tide. So they can be in sandy or rocky habitats. This one's showing a rocky habitat. And they're just really fascinating areas, because if you think of all the types of habitats on Earth, these are probably the most extreme in terms of their conditions, because sometimes they're covered in water, and sometimes parts of these habitats are exposed to the air. So if you think of the most extreme types of conditions that an animal plant can deal with, it's being covered, being in an area where you have water and need gills, or if you're in the air, need lungs. So these intertidal zones, basically where the tides go up and down, are fascinating, and you have to deal with both variations in salinity. Anyway, so basically if you ever go to the tide pools, you can see these types, and animals have all these different adaptations to deal with these extreme conditions. Clams and mussels, you can think of, they kind of close up to prevent any water loss. Barnacles can close up also. Anyway, you don't need to know too much details about that, but these different, basically the animals and plants that are best able to deal with sun and air, exposure to air would live up there, because that's where you're going to get the most exposure to air. And those organisms that are pretty mostly adapted to water, will live down there. They do have to deal with higher currents though, so you're going to see adaptations like mussels, with their with the kind of glue that they secrete, that they're able to latch onto rocks. And you can think of adaptations in sea stars that have the the tube feet, where they can hold on to rocks really firmly too, and that's another kind of condition that makes it very difficult for plants and animals, is these very strong currents and waves, and crashing waves quite often. So those are interesting ecosystems. And then the last one is the benthic zone. And if you remember the benthic organisms that I mentioned in the beginning of the slideshow, those are ones that live on the bottom, and benthic zone are basically communities that are on the ocean floor. So this would be after the intertidal zone, and this whole benthic area here. And there are, organisms that are adapted to only living on the seafloor. Mostly things like clams, a lot of crabs, organisms that they're called detritivores. They basically kind of eat all of the stuff that has kind of sunk down to the bottom, and they eat kind of scraps of plants and dead organisms. So they feed on the ocean floor. Okay, so different examples are these kind of grass beds or forests, kelp forests. If you think of plant communities, kelp forests are rooted on the bottom and they kind of go up to get to the light. And coral reefs, they're growing from the bottom too. And I believe that is it. Yep, that's it. All right, thanks, and we'll see you in class.